everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our conversation surrounded by Yemi Bamiro's One Man and His Shoes. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and for those who haven't watched it, we will give you a little synopsis. But in this conversation, we're going to talk about the sneaker culture, about Yemi's documentary, how he came to it, and about the prolific rise of the Jordan trainer. So I'm going to introduce the guys that we have today. So to start off with, we have Yemi Bamiro, who is a creative producer-director who's worked in film and television for over 15 years. Yemi has directed and produced a variety of music, sport, and arts, and specialist factual related documentaries for TV and online. His podcast credits include Channel 4, Viceland, BBC 2, BBC 4, Sky Sports, and MTV Networks. And I checked on his website, and if you really want to get in his good books, apparently he loves chocolate cake. Yemi. Also, we have with us is Jason Coles. Jason has worked in creative roles in the sports business his entire career and has rediscovered his childhood love for sneakers while working with Adidas and Reebok. It led him to write a book named Golden Kicks, The Shoes That Changed Sport, which follows the rise of the world's most famous sneakers. He also currently co-hosts a Soulful Sneakers Stories podcast with Kish Kash. And then we have Kish Kash, who is a DJ, a sneaker collector or connoisseur, as I read that he prefers to be called a connoisseur, hailing from North London, working in close partnerships with a number of music and sneaker culture events around the world. As a sneaker connoisseur, a brand consultant, DJ, Kish Kash has dedicated his life to sneakers, streetwear, and culture. So we're here to talk about Yemi's documentary. So Yemi debuts his first feature documentary of scale, which he's been working on for around 7 years. So this is a hefty journey. One Man, His Shoes examines the cultural and commercial phenomenon of the Michael Jordan against the increasing commodification of Black culture and the lack of corporate responsibility. A sportsman with once-in-a-generation talent, Jordan was held as a symbol of Black progress. He had his own phenomenal success trainer brand that made Nike one of the most profitable companies in the world. So I think we should get straight into it. Admittedly, before I watched this, I'd heard about it and known about this, but before I watched it, I thought, we've just watched The Last Dance on Netflix. Kind of got to be the same thing. Like it's, we know what we're talking about. But actually, this documentary isn't the story of really Michael Jordan or really about his sellout trainers, even though that's the basis of it. It's really a story of consumerism, of how brands use exclusivity to leverage an appetite for material good. The basis of footwear, but in reality, it speaks to a world we live in now where what we value and what we put value on for human life, which in the current climate feels even more relevant, especially in the Black community. One of the lines said in the movie was, "Wealth and status is scarce, but heavily coveted." And that one really hit home for me. And I think as a viewer, you watch it and you suddenly realize and you're struck by what society's value on the Black life is. So Yemi, starting with you, you've probably been asked this question a million times, but going straight back to the very, very beginning of this, how did you even get involved with this story and why did you feel like you wanted to tell this story?
I guess I started thinking about this film or telling this story in about 2012. That's when I sort of started thinking about it. And I thought, I'd always wanted to make something long form. I'd always had sort of ambitions and ideas to make, a longer form piece of content, a film essentially. But I knew that it was important to sort of like delve into things that I was naturally, intrigued by and fascinated by. And, I'd never call myself a sneakerhead per se, but I like trainers. I like sneakers. I've liked them since I was 10 years old, And I started thinking about brands. I started thinking about Air Jordans and I started thinking about collectors. But I started to think about the origin story of the Air Jordan. The fact that 35 years on, nothing has ever eclipsed the popularity of that shoe. And I kind of wanted to understand how, this landmark endorsement deal with Michael Jordan and Nike came about, because I'd never seen that. I'd seen films about sneaker culture. I'd seen films that sort of like, documented certain trainers, but I'd never seen a film that focused specifically on this shoe and how it happened, because, it's sneaker culture is a byproduct of everything that Michael Jordan and Nike sort of established, you know. So that's why I started to think about it, and then it was just about how do I make this film. It was, you know, I started thinking about the fact that all of my contributors and everybody that I wanted to talk to was in America, and I knew that it wouldn't, you know, this wouldn't be a film that I would be able to make in like a year or 2 years. So I just was realistic with myself, and I gave myself, I think at that time, it was November 2012, I wrote down a 3-year plan of how I intended to make the film. And yeah, that kind of stretched to 5 years. But I just knew that we were going to have to make this independently. You know, we tried to get finance, but I think the world was in a different place, you know, in 2012, 2013. I don't think the documentary was as revered as it is now in some quarters. You know, I think documentary it's not a dirty word anymore. It doesn't necessarily mean, you know, boring or, you know, sort of all the sort of like the tropes and sort of, you know, the perceptions that used to come with documentary. I think storytelling in documentary has evolved, and perhaps when we were trying to get money for this, people just couldn't see it. And then also people didn't really understand the appetite that there was for this sort of storytelling. And yeah, so we just kind of like embarked on this independent, you know, endeavor, myself and my two producers, Will Thorne and Michael Marden. And yeah, they were just kind of like mad enough, you know, they were insane like me to sort of like go on this journey, and we just kind of set about doing it. And you know, here we are now.
And here we are, yeah, in 2020.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you said in an interview recently that you didn't want to revise history or rewrite it and leave anything out. And watching it, I did feel like that was key. The story goes from a romanticized version of the growth of Erewhons, and it catches you off guard sort of when it goes a bit left. Even I was a bit like, wait, what? Wait, this is getting quite dark. When you originally storyboarded it out, was that your intention?
Well, I just knew that like anyone that knows about, you know, anyone knows about Air Jordan, the history of Air Jordan sneakers knows that, you know, in the late 80s, there were so-called sneaker crimes of, you know, in New York and sort of like in loads of sort of, you know, impoverished communities across the state, sort of like young kids getting jacked for their Air Jordan sneakers. It's very well documented. And I was a little bit, I didn't really want to shy away from that. I wanted to explore it because, you know, the tragic reality is it still happens today. Kids still get, you know, murdered and robbed for their Air Jordan sneakers. So for me, it was just part of the unfortunate history of the sneaker, you know, so I didn't want to sort of, you know, leave that out or sort of revise it, because it's you know, you can Google it and go on YouTube and find sort of like local news stories across the states about this stuff happening. And I think having met families whose sons or daughters have unfortunately, you know, been victim to this, it was even, I felt it was even more important to tell their story in a way. But the entry point to this documentary was always fandom. It was always because I was interested in Air Jordans and because I appreciated the fact that no other brand had done this before, you know, in terms of like, you know, take an African-American man who was obviously incredible at basketball and then, you know, just turn him into the most marketed, you know, sports athlete in history. That had never been done before. And I think you know, I was really interested in American culture, and when this happened, the 80s, you know, a lot of incredible things happened in the 80s and the 90s in relation to sort of, you know, rap music's mass market breakthrough. I was interested in sort of like the political landscape and the social landscape, and I was also interested in celebrity culture. I think Michael Jordan was, you know, our first superstar celebrity athlete. And we'd never seen that before. He was, you know, he to me, he kind of like remains the foundation. If you didn't have Michael Jordan and Nike, you wouldn't have David Beckham and Adidas. You wouldn't have Tiger Woods and Nike. You wouldn't have LeBron James. You wouldn't have Steph Curry and Under Armour. Do you know what I mean? I think Michael Jordan and Nike, that collaboration, that showed the world what was possible. And I think every brand has tried to sort of emulate that in some sort of way and has never been able to do it. So, you know, when I was thinking about making the film and when I was making the film, I was thinking about all of these different things and how we could tell a coherent story over the course of 85 minutes that was engaging and that wasn't a fluff piece, that was a little bit multi-dimensional. And yeah, here we are.
And a question for you, when you were making it, is there anything that you sort of discovered, any revelations that happened during the make of it that you were like, oh, I didn't know this, but I've got to sort of put this in?
Yeah, I think there were nuggets. I think hanging out and talking to David Falk, who was Michael Jordan's agent for pretty much most of his career, his stories were just phenomenal. Like, you know, and he wasn't just Michael Jordan's agent. He looked after a number of high profile like NBA players at the time in the 80s and in the 90s, including Patrick Ewing. And just some of the things that he told me were like fascinating. I think Peter Moore, who was the original designer of the Air Jordan 1, some of the stories that he told me about Tinker Hatfield and, you know, Tinker Hatfield working underneath him and, you know, Peter Moore essentially giving Tinker Hatfield his start. That all of that stuff was incredible to me, because I think most people that come to the Air Jordan phenomenon now, I think it's just Tinker Hatfield. Obviously, you know, he picked it up from the free and sort of like just ran with it. But I think, you know, Peter Moore and Rob Strasser, it all started with those two guys. Everything started with those guys are the foundation of everything. So I was really interested to hear these guys talk, because, you know, you could argue that sneaker culture exists because of these guys. And, you know, I go to Portland or I go to sort of like Washington where David Falk's office is, and like these guys are in their late 60s, 70s now, you know, and they're very kind of nonchalant about it all. They would tell me these incredible stories and I'd be like, but, you know, in a way we could argue that sneaker culture, you know, exists because of you. Like Peter Moore telling me that, you know, the original Wings logo, he kind of drew that on a plane after having a meeting with Michael Jordan. And that's how the Wings logo, you know, was formed. Like, these are stories that people don't necessarily know. And I was interested in unearthing all of these gems because they were really interesting to me. And I just kind of feel that because sneaker culture is this big thing now, and I kind of wanted to service it by saying, well, like, yeah, we know it exists. It's incredible. We all love sneakers. We all know what the byproduct of this is. But, you know, these guys are in many ways the original architects of all of this. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, I was interested in all of that. And, yeah, I love talking to those guys.
Yeah, the nuggets. I guess the nuggets are the most important. Kish, I wanted to ask you, welcome, as our trainer connoisseur. I mean, you really know your stuff. I've done my research on you, and there's not very many guys who know as much as you know. How did you feel watching this? Obviously, we watched The Last Dance, and, you know, that was a wealth of Michael Jordan and who he was as a sportsman. Was there anything that you took away from this that you felt like was quite important, or was quite, even for you, finding out things that you maybe didn't know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as Yemi says, it's these stories, you know, about the, you know, it's stuff that Jason and I have also explored with our podcast series as well. And it's just like seeing these stories of the behind the scenes, you know, the average sneaker connoisseur, sneaker enthusiast, sneakerhead, for example, doesn't actually, or isn't actually aware of the history. How did that shoe get to the shelf? What was involved in that? What was involved with the marketing, the R&D, you know, all those sort of facets, those stories that Yemi, you know, so diligently explored. You know, those are the nuggets that I gained from it. And if I'm gaining from it, it's just amazing. You know, I just love to know, you know, all these people who are not, and even the people who aren't into sneakers that will be drawn to this documentary, just, you know, as a socio-anthropological study going, wow, it's deeper. You know, the layers, it's like more than a trifle. It's like looking at the sediments of, you know, going through the, you know, the earth strata, that kind of thing. It's, you know, those sort of nuggets you're pulling out, you know, going on an archaeological dig, you know, for a forensic examination of the whole culture. It's absolutely brilliant. And, you know, I've got to give full credit to Yemi just for exciting me. You know, it's like the same with the Last Dance documentary that you mentioned, that we've referenced. And, you know, we thought we knew the Michael Jordan story.
Yeah.
No, no, we knew that much of it, and I'm sure there's even more that we can explore. And I'm fascinated to know what, you know, how Yemi will actually approach this subject. You know, hopefully there's going to be a part 2.
Another 7 years.
Some other aspect. Yeah, another 7 years. No, he might do it quicker this time. Maybe he'll learn from that process. You know, 6.5 or something like that. You know what I mean? But you know, it'd be so brilliant. You know, just to see, you know, what he does next with this. But I think this, you know, the viewers are just, you know, going to be so like surprised. You know, it's just not just about that. It's about all these ancillary things that are just going on in orbit around, say, like the central story.
Yeah,
brilliant stuff.
Yeah, very true. And Jason, for you, in your work, you've covered the rise of Air Ones, and also you and Kish have actually talked about it in your podcast with Jordan Geller, and you talk about the rise of that and the history of the Jordans. But this documentary obviously is more than that, and it's the politics behind it, as Kish just said. I just want to know from you what your takeaways were, because obviously you wrote a whole book about, you know, the rise in the politics behind the scenes. Is there anything new that you learned as well?
There were quite a few things. I mean, first of all, I just want to say to Yemi, amazing job. You know, brilliant doc.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen pretty much every sneaker doc that's ever been made, and this does set a new benchmark. So yeah, everyone needs to go and see it. Oh. Pleasure. No. So yeah, I mean, I got to say, when I first heard that Yemi was going to make it, I was a bit worried that it was going to be kind of yet another kind of fanboy Jordan film, because there have been a few. So I just thought it was just so refreshing. You know, it kind of, I think Jordan, quite rightly, there is a lot of reverence that people have for him, but it's when you kind of go deeper into the story and you see not necessarily just some of those darker aspects that, you know, Yemi explores, but just the ins and outs of, you know, how these deals have happened and how it actually affected not just sneaker culture, but American culture. You know, Michael Jordan was one of the first kind of athletes who just completely transcended sport. You know, he was everywhere. He was on the side of cereal packets. He was selling Gatorade. He was selling McDonald's. He was selling everything. So I think it's really good from the point of view of looking at it, at how it kind of changed not just American culture, but also the role of the black athlete in many ways in American sport. So while I kind of knew a lot of the story, I just loved the way that Yemi went into areas that no one has ever really explored before, you know. And I have to say, you know, he's got some balls on him for doing some of those things.
Yeah.
And some of the contributors that you got, Yemi, especially, you know, Julie Strasser, who I don't think has ever been on camera before. Who wrote a brilliant book called Swoosh, which again, I think Nike would probably want to burn every single copy.
Yeah.
But so well done for talking to Julie, but also, you know, that some of the contributors, you know, that Yemi was able to get. I mean, pretty much anyone who was there, I think Yemi got, you know, people like Peter Moore, who we've discussed, but like people like Sonny Vaccaro, you know, and again, some of the other contributors, people like Jamila Hill and Russ Bankston, Babito Garcia, so people who really know the topic. So for me, it was just kind of a complete doc, you know, and it's not often you watch something, especially me, I'm kind of always a bit cynical when I watch sneaker documentaries, especially because I'm always looking for what have they left out, and I just couldn't really find anything. So yeah, I mean, it certainly gets my seal of approval.
Yeah, Yemi actually, from a filmmaking point of view, reaching out to people who are big dogs, and you just being, you know, doing this kind of off your own back and not really having, you know, a big channel behind you to sort of rev up interest for people to want to take part. How did you persuade people to take part and to contribute?
Well, I mean, that's one of the reasons why it took 7 years. I think everyone that you ask is not necessarily going to be in your documentary, but I think the key is to perhaps keep asking. And I think that was one of the things with this. It took me, so for instance, Sonny Vaccaro. So it took me about 2 years to convince Sonny to be in the film. And then I ended up interviewing him twice in the end. And yeah, I kind of count him and his wife Pam as friends. They've been so supportive of this project. They're incredible people, and you know they really appreciated the film, and it just helped. I think what really helped me out was kind of like connecting the dots. So, for instance, Roland Lazenby, Michael Jordan's biographer, he wrote, you know, the most definitive, in my opinion, book, has written the most definitive book on Michael Jordan, called The Life. It's incredible. It's sort of like, you just need to read that book and then you pretty know it all there. And he spoke to everybody in that book. So I interviewed him pretty early on. I interviewed him, Roland Lazenby, in about 2014. And then he was really kind, and he sort of like helped me get in touch with Sonny. And then I think once I got in touch with Sonny, I was able to get in touch with Jim Riswold and Peter Moore. And it's just kind of like connecting the dots, you know, because I think people want to know who else is involved. And I think once I'd spoken to Peter, I was able to sort of, you know, make contact with Julie. And yeah, Julie was incredible. She's an amazing woman, and people don't know that she worked at Nike quite early on, and she was around when, you know, Rob was there, and Rob, you know, was sort of laying the foundations of what, you know, Nike's basketball division would be. When they were trying to work it out, it was Rob and Peter and a little bit of Phil Knight. So in terms of getting people, it was just, you know, just emailing people and asking them. And to be completely honest with you, I think there's a part of, you know, we've all got egos. And I think if some random guy from South London calls you up or messages you on email saying, you know, I'm willing to sort of like fly across the world to sort of interview you about your life or about your opinions in relation to this, most people will be like, oh yeah, cool, come and talk to me. And I think that's what it was. There was a lot of goodwill, and people were really kind to me and, you know, generous with their time. And yeah, I just put it down to that. I just put it down to people, amazing, you know, wanting to be a part of it and tell their part of the story. So
amazing. So moving on to the culture of the sneaker. Obviously, you guys, maybe more Jason and Kish, really know what they're talking about. But Kish, you grew up in a small market town of Aylesbury, but you said that you used to go...
have done your research. Wow.
Research.
Okay.
But you used to say that you used to run into Soho every chance you used to get, because you just felt like Soho was like the soul. It had, you know, it just had so much heart.
Yeah.
Growing up, what was the buzz? What sort of created this like culture that you were like, I've got to be part of this? What was the buzz?
I don't know. I've just been an inquisitive dude, I guess, at the end of the day. But you know, I've just been into different things. You know, growing up as a kid, things that I gravitated towards was music. So deeply into my music, you know. So going into Soho, you know, I'd find more record stores than I had in my hometown, and I'd be able to get better hip hop records, got Groove Records or Red Records, and all these other seminal record stores back then. Clothing wise as well, you know, you have just more there. There was just more in London, and as soon as I was, you know, able to jump on the train and just, you know, head in, I did that, and that was the thing. It's just like trying to explore, just get involved, and yeah, I mean, you know, Aylesbury didn't have a predominantly big football club. Aylesbury United's never really got to the heights. You know. Yeah, exactly. So, you know, football culture was, for me, it was a kickabout in the street or in the park with my mates. And, you know, you was wearing trainers, you know, and you had a certain selection as a kid. You know, I used to gravitate towards certain iconic athletes of the time, but nowhere near the status of what Michael Jordan would later accomplish. You know, you like your you know, Bjorn Borgs, for example, you know, your Seb Coes, all these sort of things, you know, and you know, wishing to emulate footballers, but anything that footballers wore obviously could only be worn on the pitch. So, you know, you wasn't about to go walk around in a pair of football boots, you know what I mean? So, you know, you had athletes such as Pele and Maradona at the time that you looked at. But yeah, just going into London, exploring and see what's good, hunting and seeing, you know, what's about. And there's always that sense of sensibility. And it's also fueled, you know, by my, you know, I was able to go see my family in America, and that's how I became more aware of basketball culture. And another aspect of what introduced me to basketball stars such as Larry Bird and Magic Johnson, etc., were when I bought comic books. They used to have the adverts. The American comic books used to have adverts, and used to have adverts for, you know, these guys endorsing things, you know, and their sneakers. And I'm just like going, yeah, what's going on here? Then you'd also see rap videos, and you'd see that kind of thing going on. And, you know, you'd be like, whoa, what's, you know, this whole thing, like watching Rocksteady Crew and the record covers that you used to get as well. And the vinyl record covers, got a few behind me here. Still,
just a few behind you.
Just a smidgen, yeah. But, you know, it was like, seeing what they were wearing and going, okay, cool. But the one thing that was kind of critical that hasn't sort of followed on from time was you'd have to have your own unique style, and you'd have to have your own acumen, and you have to express uniquely.
Yeah.
So if your friend had something, you didn't have it. So if you saw your rappers or whatever wearing something, they gave you style cues sometimes, but you didn't do that. And the same with the football casuals as well. It was like, okay, those are kind of popular. You know, but what can I do to be different from my friends?
Yeah.
And you know, that was the key tenets, I think, for that, I guess.
That actually brings me on to a very good point. My next question for you. You did say in an interview that you would argue that street style has got less to do with the street than it ever has done before, because most of the people who are wearing it now aren't actually from the street. They just want to look like they are.
Yeah.
And I actually thought that was quite a powerful comment. For you, as someone who's been part of the culture for such a long time, do you feel like the sneaker culture has lost its authenticity?
To a degree. It's always a compromise. Evolution happens, and there's a pro and a con to every sort of aspect of our life with regards to that. But that's a great question. You know, I'm looking at, you know, things sort of like, it's not half full, half empty. It just is, and we just sort of try to mediate, and discussions such as this will hopefully help to inform and educate people, in documentaries such as Yemi is so diligently approached and done. Again, we'll find, you know, people find references, and they'll be inspired as well, and they'll hopefully start to look at things deeper and differently, with a different consideration, a higher level of maturity possibly. But yeah, I mean, you know, with the tipping point, one thing I have got to be critical about for the sports brands, is that they're willing to take from the street, but how much are they willing to give back? You know, that's the key thing here. You know, we've seen a negative side of things with the documentary, and it's the same with any sort of commodity in life. You know, the aspirations of somebody who doesn't have wants, and some people will go to whatever lengths it takes, even approaching in a negative manner. So you get carjackings and so on. I want that, and blah blah blah, and all this. But the thing is, it's more immediate with what's on your feet, and the after effects are that hit home that much more, you know, when we see that. So markets, you know, the marketing thing, the whole resale thing that's going on right now, I think that's really having a negative effect, putting a value of commodity on things. For me, these sneakers here mean stories. You know, they mean the people I've met through them, the design process in there, you know, what happened, how did we get to that, what inspired them, who's been wearing it, what does it do to them, how does it affect them? You know, that's the key thing. Yeah. And that's right, when people just go cha-ching, that's money, money, money. Mm-hmm. It just, you know, it's like, okay, cool. But when the majority of people are looking at things in a fiscal fashion, then it just sort of erodes the character, it erodes the integrity of it all, I feel.
Yeah, and actually,
that's the key thing.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because I think, Yemi, actually, you not being like a big sneakerhead meant that you could detach yourself from the actual product. And what I think you did really cleverly is, at the beginning it was like, wow, this is amazing, Michael Jordan, amazing, amazing, amazing. And then you were like, actually, let's get to the heart of this. You know, for most people, buying shoes or buying anything is an endorphin rush. That's what consumerism is based on, an endorphin rush. And for you making this, did you feel like it was important for you to sort of tell the dark side of consumerism and that endorphin rush?
Yeah, I mean, I like, yes and no. I kind of, you know, I kind of wanted to tell, I wanted to be true to the story. And the story is that, you know, there have been these crimes for a long time and they still happen. I think me sort of probing into why that happens is a different documentary. It's, you know, I kind of feel that we can't boil it down to sort of just Nike or just, you know, it's structural stuff. It's sort of, you know, it's government policy. It's so much bigger than just that. So yeah, I can't necessarily say that was at the forefront of my mind. I just wanted to explore and prod, you know, the fact that this sneaker has a history. And for 60 minutes in that film, 70 minutes, you see the history, you see how it played out, you see the origin story, and you see, you know, the building blocks to which got it to where it is. And then unfortunately, there's another, you know, there's another part of the history that, you know, I had to explore, because I didn't want to revise things, and I wanted to be authentic. And I, you know, like Jason alluded to, you know, you watch things and you're kind of like, well, okay, like, you know, what is this telling me? I didn't want this film to have an agenda. I just wanted to sort of like be really honest and be really, you know, like, I kind of feel, I read some things on Twitter and they came from like sneakerheads. I think people just wanted 70 minutes of like, you know, like Michael
Beautiful
Jordan
sneakers.
slam dunking, yeah, and then like sort of, you know, I think people wanted that, and they weren't really willing to sort of accept the final third of the film. But you know, I started my career as a journalist, and I kind of felt like, as a journalist, as a filmmaker, you know, you're kind of taught to, you know, tell the whole story and leave people, you know, to kind of like reach their own conclusions. I didn't go in there to sort of like say, you know, you must think this about this brand or about these people. It was more like, well, you know, here are all the facts, make your own mind up. I didn't want it to feel like, you know, we ever had an agenda. And like I've said, like, you know, my entry point into this was fandom. You know, I remember being 13 and 14 years old and sort of like going to secondary school in South London, and, you know, having a kind of like a Chicago Bulls jacket and understanding, you know, that Michael Jordan was larger than life, and understanding that sort of like this African-American man was basically like God. When it came to this sport, and when it came to sort of like corporate America. And I knew like at a really young age, like how important that was, that, you know, he was the most marketed man in history.
For sure, yeah.
So, yeah, I think it's not necessarily about, like the darker side, so to speak. It's just about telling a story that is honest and authentic and sort of like presents the facts, basically.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like,
yeah, because it's like having a Michael Jordan shoe on your foot is a relatively affordable sort of social status affecting product. You know, you can't have your BMW, you can't have your Mercedes, but I got Jordans on my feet. And what that means is it's that price point, the athlete behind it, and so on and so forth, and the story that, you know, Yemi's, you know, done. And it's like, if you've got those, it's like, I've made something. You know, it's like it's even more than like having the latest Air Maxes or whatever. It's like, I got Jordans on my feet.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, it's that iconography and that level of, you know, brand, you know, endorsement. Really, it sits along with the premier brands within their respective fields, you could argue.
Yeah, very true. Jason, for you, Golden Kicks, GQ did say your book examines the lives of trainers not only changed sport, but sportswear forever. I was wondering for you, what do you think the turning point was when actually the trainers became more important than the game?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's been lots of debate over that, really. I mean, debatably, you can almost go back to the late 19th century, because as Kish and I discovered on our podcast, we talked to a friend of ours called Dr. Thomas Turner, who pointed out that in some ways sneaker culture isn't a new thing, and that it first started really when people started playing lawn tennis. And because it became kind of a cultural thing and a status symbol thing, people wanted to wear the right clothes. And so those early tennis shoes, and that's why that term came about for a long time, tennis shoes, became, you know, that thing that kind of, you know, made you stand out in society in many ways. So I think, yeah, I mean, you can go back all that way, and people in some respects don't like to, because it seems that long ago, and people want to think that sneaker culture is this kind of fairly new thing. But really it isn't, and it's kind of gone through cycles, you know, probably, well, through the last 100 years in many ways. I mean, another thing that kind of astounded us on Soulful was when we were talking about the Converse All-Star. You know, in 2017, that shoe was 100 years old. And yet, you know, I can't remember, I think they still sell something like 250,000 pairs a day, which when when you realize that shoe's 100 years old, if you were to tell someone that, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't wear them so much. but that's the way it is. I think the thing with the brands especially is that they kind of endlessly recycle nostalgia and then add something new on top of it. And we've just seen that all along. Even when you look at some of the newer brands, when you look at some of the brands that are kind of only recently coming into it, so people like Balenciaga and Dior, etc. When you look at a lot of those shoes, so I guess the uninitiated, they look like kind of new, very futuristic designs. I guess to the slightly older hats, we look at those and we can see certain design cues in it. So you look at that Balenciaga Triple S, and I know I'm looking at it, and probably Kish is looking at, and we're saying, well, that's an old New Balance shoe from the 80s or 90s. So I think that's the thing with sneaker culture, is that it's obsessed with nostalgia. It's obsessed with its own past.
Sure. And actually, interesting enough, sort of as 2020, I think we did need a question, at this point, if it is about nostalgia, what does come first, the chicken or the egg? Sportswear, sports, fashion, street culture. Are they all as relevant as each other? Or at this stage in 2020, is one more relevant than the other, do you think?
They're all sort of in tandem, wouldn't you say, Jace?
Yeah, I think so. I think more and more, though, sport is kind of playing less of a role. And, we're seeing more of the collabs, especially with, artists, musicians especially, are having, you only have to look at what, Kanye West has done. All the brands now have got their kind of, premier musicians. Yeah, exactly. So you had, Puma with Rihanna, and they've brought Jay-Z on as the creative director on basketball. So more and more, I think, in a way, sport is having less of an influence, and I think more and more other things. So the number of collabs is just amazing. I find it amazing, when they brought out the Chunky Dunk, a Ben and Jerry's collaboration. It's like, what is going on?
Yeah.
But I think.
Can I ask though, Jason, for you and for Kish, does the collaboration thing feel like disappointing? Or are you okay with the evolution?
Sometimes not. It depends on the collaboration, how honest and what integrity it has. And if it's playful, the Ben and Jerry's one is so playful. It's fun. Everyone loves ice cream, and they probably go to ice cream parlors wearing sneakers or whatever. At the end of the day, it's a cool thing. And I look at that as a moment in pop culture. It's really sort of broken through that bubble. It's not just that microcosm, it's now exploded into the zeitgeist. It's amazing. It really is.
Yeah. That's actually quite nice that you think of it as a positive thing, because most people will be like, no, sneakers are what they need to be. It needs to stay in sport. It needs to be what it is, to stay authentic. But actually, authenticity can kind of grow, is kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, no, definitely. When you look at what we're dealing with now with regards to Yeezy, etc., the foundation of that sort of aspect of sneaker culture, it came from Run DMC. And their endorsement deal, which is another massive moment in the 80s, and those sort of the stories that Yemi obviously discovered and approached and as relayed, worked in tandem, with that, and we're seeing the sort of the benefits of that. But I was saying to someone the other day, it's like music artists are now the new athletes.
100%. Just what Travis Scott has done with Jordan Brand is insane.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, absolutely insane. Right. Because I think his fan base is just like really passionate and enthusiastic anyway. And you sort of like, you transfer that over to sort of like sneakers and you give them a partnership with Jordan. It's insane, And I think you look at Virgil, you look at what Drake's done with Nike. It's like, it's kind of like musicians are the new pitchman.
That's it.
They are, they are probably as important, if not more, than athletes. Because I think those athletes, athletes like Jordan don't come along every single day. Do you know what I mean? I think you've got LeBron, who, you can sort of like argue is probably the closest in terms of like selling, product and selling sneakers. And then that's probably it. Kobe was up there as well. Steph Curry with Under Armour.
Do you guys think, can I ask, do you think that the sports industry should be worried about that? The fact that they rely solely on these sports stars to sort of make more money for them. If it's going to go to music, what happens to sport.
Yeah, well, this is one thing that Jason and I were discussing, is the erosion of the character, of the personality associated with athletes. They're surrounded by so many people, all these endorsement deals. You can't say that because otherwise you're going to lose that sponsor. You can't do this, you can't do that.
Sure.
Back then, things that, you know, there were no breaks. Do you know what I mean? You had colourful characters. But what musicians can do, they can say whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly,
They're not hindered by that.
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny. It's kind of weird because when you look at all the colourful, you know, sports stars, the exuberant sports stars, Agassi. I mean, when he came out in the way what he did in tennis, and his whole, you know, the way he blazed through, you know, just with the way he's played, but his uniform, you know, all the style, etc. It was very like
denim on court.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Oh, that's a uniform violation. Well, someone was learning from what happened to Jordan. See? Right, it's like, okay, we can use that, and we can, you know, use that, but the thing is that's kind of been lost a little bit, which is a shame. Nike did do you know, a little bit with Kaepernick, with Colin Kaepernick and that, but they didn't do enough.
Right,
Didn't do enough.
Yeah.
And that's a story which still resonates and still needs to be propelled, because, you know, that's just, we just started that story. And I think sports companies, if they really want to, you know, have a degree of honesty and integrity, more importantly, and try to change things up. You've taken so much from the street, as I said earlier. Can you give back? And can you do it in an honest way? Yeah, making some basketball courts out of reground basketball sold. That's great. More. Come on. Mentorship programs. We need to get people, you know, channeling their passions, their anger, you know, their creativity in a more positive way. I feel.
100%.
Well, then actually that, you know, my question for you, Yemi, touching on politics, definitely saw that thing at the end when, you know, also the imagery of the Black people protesting, and obviously everything was happening with Black Lives right now. And I did get a little lump in my throat because I thought, did he have to re-edit this section to include the little Black Lives Matter thing, or is that actually already currently there, and it just shows that the Black Lives thing has been happening before the Black Lives thing became a thing?
It was always there. I think you know, I think Jamil Hill said, like, Black people have always made things cool in culture, you know, and it's always been there. I kind of feel like Black culture has always been at the heart of so many things, and I don't necessarily feel that corporate America has ever, you know, really appreciated that. And I think what's happening now is just proof of that, you know. I think there's been a lot of performative activism by these companies and by these brands, but I think the proof will ultimately be in the pudding. You know, I think the Kaepernick thing and the Nike thing, you know, they took a calculated, you know, risk. They took a gamble with that, but it was calculated. They're shrewd operators, and, you know, they endorsed Kaepernick, and, you know, some people in Ohio were burning Nike shoes, but, like, you know, Gen Z and sort of, like, you know, young people were like, yeah, you know, we appreciate you for doing that, because I think people increasingly want to know what these brands they're buying into represent. And I think Nike knew that, you know, if they took this calculated, shrewd move, then, you know, then it would make sense to them. But I think that they did it because, you know, they did it ultimately because their bottom line was important. I think if you kind of, like, if you check the correlation between, you know, them endorsing Kaepernick in the way that they did, and, you know, sales of that quarter, they were through the roof. And I think, like Jamil Hill says in the film, it's like they will be on the right side of history, but they won't be on the right side of history because they care about social justice. They'll be, you know, they care about profit, and they care about bottom line, and that's, you know, internally that stuff's important. But I think the consumer is becoming increasingly, you know, shrewd and sort of, like, aware of, like, how these brands, you know, work and function. And I think, you know, a lot of it is just becoming a little bit transparent. So it remains to be seen what will happen. But, you know, these guys are not doing this stuff because they care about, you know, these issues, or they care about social justice. They care about money. They're businesses. Do you know what I mean? And you know, if they can do anything to sort of, like, leverage more money out of consumers, then they will 100% do that. If that means endorsing Colin Kaepernick, that, you know, well, that's what it will mean, and that's what it comes to. So I think it's just the way of the world.
It's like masters of exploiting controversy. You know, it's like when you have a look at a headline, the Sun newspaper, the most widely read newspaper within this country, and the Mirror, etc. Sensationalist clickbait, you know, was how I would look at it, headlines if you're online. That's what it's about. And it's a similar process to selling, you know, a product. That's how you sell newspapers. That's how you sell, you know, clicks on a website. That's how you sell product, you know.
Yeah. It's the attraction. To sort of wrap it up towards the end, Jason, I wanted to ask you, considering we've said that with visibility for consumers and visibility for brands, and whether they're authentic or not, they kind of feel like they have to be visible. What do you think the future of sneaker culture is, and for the brands is, if they have to be this visible all the time?
Well, I think they need to start kind of empowering people again, because arguably, and something that Yemi touches on in his film, is that by kind of making these athletes and people into huge stars, in many respects, they've kind of robbed them of their voices. Jordan was one of the first in many ways who kind of didn't pick up the baton from his predecessors. So black athletes before him, you know, they used their platform as a way to fight for social justice. But Jordan, I think because he became such a commercial machine, just kind of allowed that to shut him up, really, whether he wanted to, or whether that was Nike or just the sheer number of brands who were sponsoring him. And I think the problem was that you had a whole succession of athletes, probably up until recent times, who were in a similar position. They couldn't really speak out about social justice because effectively they were being paid hush money. I think that's probably, for me, in terms of where sneaker culture goes, I think these brands need to now change their relationships with the people that buy the shoes, but also with their athletes, to get them to really fight for that. You know, everything that's been happening this year, it's got to change. You know, I think in many ways, you know, taking a knee isn't enough. And I think it was great what Nike did with Kaepernick, but it just wasn't enough. And so I think that's what really needs to happen. I think, we can have loads of, you know, new collabs, and there can be more people coming in and doing them and things. But I think, if anything, what these brands need to be doing is empowering people more, getting people to, you know, buy into that. When you buy those sneakers, you're effectively empowering, you know, those athletes, those artists to speak out more. I think that's really what needs to happen. It's got to be more than about just buying shoes now.
Yeah, it's actually interesting, because you're wanting it to go from being this exclusive, hungry endorphin rush to actually, we need empowerment. And that's the world we live in 2020, which is like, I need to actually feel empowered by wearing shoes if that's possible. I want to feel that.
Exactly.
So yeah, I guess we're asking brands to do. To wrap up, Yemi, I think because this is your doc and your starring moment, I want to ask you, so people know, what do you have coming up next, or what are you working on? What's your, now that you're going to be worldwide famous, because Nike are probably going to come after you and be like, dude, what are you doing? What do you think you're going to do next?
I don't know. I've got some ideas. I want to make more films. You know, I kind of want to make multifaceted, multi-dimensional films that I think, on the one hand, you think tell you one thing, but if you kind of like peel back a little bit more, you know, it's about so much more interesting, you know, elements of that story. And those are the sort of, you know, that's the storytelling that I'm interested. Those are the kind of like narratives I kind of want to explore. So there's nothing concrete at the moment, but yeah, I'm definitely, thinking about how I can, you know, follow up with this film. So yeah, we'll see.
Amazing. And one last question, Kish, I got to ask, when is too many trainers to own? What number are you going to get to?
I don't think it is about too many trainers. The thing is, it's not how many I own. What my whole goal is, and Jason and I have spoken about this at length, is we're archivists. We're preserving the future. We're trying to put everything into context. What Yemi's doing is trying to put those stories into context. We're responsible for that. And otherwise history is going to be lost, and all these stories and all these fantastic designs and everything that's associated with it will be lost. So it's important that we try to preserve that.
God, I wish I was your shoe size. I'd be over there in like a minute. Thank you guys so much for being part of this and having this conversation. For anyone who hasn't seen it, go and see it. It'll be at the BFI, but also find it, because it's an incredible story and told in a very authentic way. And I think you'll take a lot more from it than just, these are amazing trainers and this is about Michael Jordan. This has got a lot of depth and a lot of things I personally also learned. So yeah, well done, Yemi. It was amazing.
Thank you.
Great job.
Great job.
Thanks,
Absolutely
guys.
brilliant.